This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 80 of Here's How for the 27th of November 2018. Brexit, 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 Brexit. That's all you're going to be hearing about for a while. Get used to it.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
Coming up in a few minutes.
Brilliant. So if Thomas Edison hadn't tried to progress something called the light bulb, we'd still be operating with candles.
No, not at all. It's that you don't blow out your candle until the light bulb works.
It's called progress.
People on both sides of the border in Ireland are essentially being asked to blow out their candles and dispose of all their candles on the promise that a light bulb will come.
You've already accepted, and therefore I presume that people you talk to in Ireland know and accept and understand that a quantity of smuggling goes on at the moment. But it is so small, it is so low level, that actually you're making a much bigger issue of this than actually needs to be made of.
That's coming up in a minute, but first, apologies for the long absence. I was overtaken by work and other commitments, but now I'm back. I was talking over the weekend to some people who could loosely be described as politicians, and we were discussing the mathematics of Theresa May getting her newly signed Brexit deal through the British Parliament, or not, as it seems. Some British sources, it's hard to tell whether they are May supporters or opponents, but some British sources are talking about a second vote in their parliament, perhaps a few weeks after the first vote, and that enough pressure would be inflicted on enough of the waverers to get the thing passed. There's one point that I think they're missing. If one vote going the wrong way in the Parliament can be overturned when necessary, then why not do the same with the public vote, the referendum result, especially now given that the British public seem to have at least some idea what Brexit will result in, which wasn't the case in 2016. But that's just one of the options if the vote goes against May's deal, as seems almost certain. I should put in a rider here. There have been knighthoods given out in the strangest of ways in the past couple of weeks. Also, whatever the commitment of the DUP to the Union, I don't think much of the argument that they will vote for the deal to avoid a Corbyn government, but I do think that their commitment to the Queen is only surpassed by their commitment to the Queen's shilling. They can be bought. The only question is the price. But let's assume that the vote goes down. Then what? The dream of the Brexit hardliners is that it triggers a no-deal exit. The least supported scenario happens by default. That's a possibility. At the other end of the spectrum, there is a dream that would be another referendum, a people's vote, that would halt Brexit altogether. I think that those two scenarios are unlikely, although the situation is so unstable that they can't be ruled out. What I think is most likely is that the men in grey suits step in and prevent total chaos, and that Britain ends up in some sort of half-in, half-out EFTA-style situation. The one difficulty with that assumption is that the famed British civil service, which prides itself on having once run an empire where the sun never set, yada yada, will be able to save the day. But that's just the problem. They still believe in their competence, despite the overwhelming evidence against it. They're not so much running on fumes as being Wile E. Coyote running off the cliff edge and keeping on going until they look down just before gravity kicks in. But my problem with this whole discussion is that right across the political spectrum in Ireland, there is a hint of a smug self-satisfaction. Aren't we great? We're not half as daft as those idiot Brits. See how stupid they are, messing up their whole country. Well, maybe. But we're not the roadrunner. The predictions, if the UK goes to something like an EFTA association with the EU, are bad. If they crash out, it's dire. But Ireland's economy is intimately linked with the UK. If it's bad for them, it's almost equally bad for us. And if it's dire for them, we get that too. There are no good outcomes here, but for sure, some are worse than others.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
Richard Tice is a British businessman. He's heavily involved in property management and development, and he's best known as founder of the pro-Brexit organisation Leave.EU, and also as the former co-chair of the referendum campaign group Leave.EU. Richard is on the line now. Richard, Brexit, it's all going swimmingly, yeah?
If you believe that, then you clearly haven't been listening to the news for many, many months indeed.
Oh, this is what you've been campaigning for. You're getting everything you want, are you?
Well, the reality is that we have a government in the UK led by a Prime Minister who doesn't believe in Brexit, together with civil servants led by Ollie Robbins, who are doing their very best to ensure that we Brexit in name only, and that actually Brexit in truth means remain, which is obviously a matter of deep concern and regret to all of us.
Hold on for a second. Hold on for a second there. The Brexit secretary for most of the time that post has existed has been David Davis, who's an ardent Brexiteer. He was in position negotiating in the bulk of the time that they had to negotiate. Surely you'd accept that he's done a stand-up job?
No, I wouldn't, to be honest. He was guilty of a certain naivety. He assumed that when he gave instructions to his civil servants, they would carry them out. And he assumed that number 10 was going to let him get on with a job. Unfortunately, both those things turned out to be not the case. And what actually happened is that number 10 had a black ops unit operating in secret that produced, totally unbeknown to David Davis and Steve Baker at the Chequers meeting in July, that unit, led by Ollie Robbins, produced a completely different plan that no one in the Brexit department had seen. Subsequent to that, and this is very important, we've seen that Dominic Raab took over, and he took a more detailed interest in the workings of what was going on with the detailed negotiations. And even with that additional closer interest, he was completely undermined last week when the document was produced to Cabinet, and there were clauses in there that he hadn't seen, hadn't agreed. Again, a Brexit secretary totally undermined by number 10.
Isn't the problem, Richard, that the one substance that is like kryptonite for Superman when it comes to Brexit, the substance that Brexiteers cannot tolerate, is paper? When their plans need to actually be written down, it can't happen. And the reality is not that David Davis or Dominic Raab were either traduced or not up to the job. It's that the job can't be done. There are circles there that can't be squared.
That is complete and utter nonsense.
Oh, okay, then hold on that point. Hold on that point exactly. Well, let me have my say. Go on then.
So, we Brexiteers have been making it clear at Leave Means Leave and by the European Research Group for over a year now that the simple answer, and what David Davis was working for, was towards a Canada-style free trade agreement. And that was on offer by the European Union, and that is what we should work towards. Number 10, in their own dogmatic, stubborn way, have insisted on a different approach. And that is why we've ended up in the shambles that we currently are in, where we have, number 10 has agreed to pay £39 billion for nothing in return. No conditionality whatsoever. All we get for that is the right to negotiate a new free trade deal. big deal.
Well, let me then ask you specifically, because we hear this so often, people talking about a Canada-style deal, and it sounds a little bit, I don't know, like some beef or venison that you might make, but it's not very specific. And there are very hard, specific questions that just doesn't answer. And if I give you 1 point, I'll give you 3 items: no border in the Irish Sea, no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, and no EU contribution to the UK customs and standards regime. You can choose 2 of those, but you can't have all 3.
I'm very happy to answer all 3 because
do you imagine that all 3 can be achieved?
Of course they can, because first of all, this whole Irish border issue has been completely confected and dreamt up by the European Union in order to suit its own negotiating leverage. Now, that's fine.
Bear in mind you're talking to an Irish audience, largely here.
Absolutely. And, let's be very clear about this. I am talking to an Irish audience, and I'm quite sure that many of your listeners will be aware that the EU's own expert, a nice gentleman called Lars Carlson, wrote a report called Smart Borders 2, where he confirmed for the European Union Commission that a completely frictionless border could be achieved using existing arrangements and using technology, trusted traders, authorized economic operators, and waivers for small firms. That is the same approach that is from the European Research Group led by Jacob Rees-Mogg. It's the same approach that we job. Unfortunately, our own civil servants have completely failed to put that to the negotiators in Brussels because they didn't want to find a solution.
Why is that?
Because the civil servants in the UK don't believe in what they've been asked to negotiate, and it's utterly disgraceful the way that they have behaved.
So you're essentially saying that all of these problems are down to a conspiracy of civil servants?
A combination of that and a failure of our own UK ministers to get a grip of this situation. Yes. I mean, look, at the end of the day, negotiation is a two-way thing, and I admire and respect the way that the EU, on behalf of the 27, have conducted this process. Look, all good power to their elbow. Our side have utterly failed. They refuse to bring on board anybody in terms of proper Brexiteers from the private sector to assist. They actually banned us from helping, and they've done it themselves, and we are in the shambles that we are.
You say from the private sector, and you're obviously very heavily situated in the private sector.
Yeah, and we know how to negotiate.
And you're a businessman. You're not a fake businessman by any means. You are involved in companies that are multi hundreds of millions of pounds sterling.
I run £1 billion multinational business listed on the stock market where I tripled the share price in 4 years. So I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. But those. As I can see it, you may want to correct me, but those businesses tend to be heavily involved in property management and development. They are the types of businesses that are least often internationally traded. If you're talking to...
What do you mean internationally traded?
Property anywhere can't really be sold overseas, and building materials are...
Well, I mean... clearly property is a physical thing, but building materials move all over the world. We buy double glazing systems from China, for example. So, components come from everywhere. My point in that,
Richard, is that although I don't dispute the sincerity of your views, people who are involved in heavily internationally traded businesses, for example, car plants, for example, British Aerospace, they are conspicuously, hold on for a second, Richard, they are conspicuously disagreeing with you in numbers. That is true, isn't it?
The automotive sector in the UK and the EU, yes, because they are the vested interests of multinationals who want the status quo to continue. It's interesting though, isn't it? Lots of cars are made in the US. Lots of cars are made in the Far East. And guess what? They don't have an EU trading bloc. And somehow they seem to cope really rather well. They make good cars. They make good profits. And they have just in time. So,
hold on for a second. You're specifically, Richard, you're specifically incorrect on that. The cars made, for example, in the US typically contain components from right across the US, and those products arrive just in time at assembly plants in an incredibly complex network of transport and logistics. And that's essentially what happens in the EU.
Are you making the suggestion that all the components components in US cars are made in the US. That is not correct.
Lots of components a very high proportion of them.
What about in the Far East? Lots of components are made in the Far East. But the real opportunity there for UK manufacturers and for UK automotives is to say, well, if there's a tiny bit of friction or a tiny bit of cost, hey guys, what about getting our components made in the UK? What a wonderful opportunity for UK manufacturing. And the same is happening in my sector, in house building. Guess what's happening? UK house builders are sourcing more materials, more components from UK manufacturers. Guess what, guys? UK manufacturing is doing rather well in the UK at the moment because this is happening. Good news. It's called competition. It's called free markets.
Well, no, it's not actually, because what you're doing is reducing the size of the market that you're operating in. That typically hobbles economic growth, doesn't it?
Interesting, isn't it, that Tim Martin, chairman of Wetherspoons, they run 1,000 pubs. Okay, historically they've bought and consumed a huge amount of alcohol from the EU. When he asked his buying department to stop buying from the EU, so they're going to buy no more wine, no more brandy, no more spirits, nothing. Guess what? They found all those products available elsewhere in the world. It's called competition, and people will source materials from all over the world. We live in a global economy, and that is to be celebrated and enjoyed. We don't need to unnecessarily tie ourselves in a protectionist customs union that is basically run by the European Union.
And that's your view in terms of competition. But would you accept the point that leaders of businesses who trade heavily internationally, and also the economic indicators, so for example, share prices and the price of the pound on international markets, would you accept or no, Richard, no, perhaps listen to the question first. The point is that the changes in those values do tend to indicate that the great bulk of people who work in internationally traded businesses don't agree with you. Whether you're free to disagree with them, but you would agree they disagree with you.
No, I don't at all. The two of the greatest entrepreneurs in this country, James Dyson, for Dyson. I'm not
suggesting that you can't find counterexamples. But the day of the Brexit referendum, the pound sterling fell 15% on international markets and has not recovered. It's actually continued to slide. That indicates a loss of faith in the British economy, doesn't it?
Utter nonsense. Really, you are talking gibberish. For heaven's sake, we employ over 500,000 more people than we did on the day of the referendum. GDP has gone up. Our GDP growth is exceeding the Eurozone average. Just in the last quarter, for example, France and Germany have slipped into minus numbers. The UK, 2 years on for the referendum, doing rather nicely. Thank you very much. Project Fear, totally and utterly proven to be nonsense. Manufacturing is doing really rather well. So, we've got a huge amount to be proud of. And as I was just trying to explain, two of our greatest entrepreneurs in this country, James Dyson, Sir Anthony Bamford, they make products that are sold globally, and they are quite happy to go to world trade rules. And if we do that, we should pay the European Union zero, not a single penny.
I'm not going to persuade you about the economic good or ill of Brexit. I don't have ambitions to do that. But my question is just, would you accept that there are a huge chunk of people in business who don't agree with you?
The nature of politics is that you're always going to find people either side of the argument. All I would say is... But the
preponderance of people in business are not on your side.
I don't accept that.
Okay, that's fair enough.
The multinationals are not on our side. But it's interesting, isn't it? Just over the weekend, we've had a letter produced by almost 200 British entrepreneurs of SMEs who've said in that letter they're quite happy to go to world trade rules. This is what's happening here is that you've got the big businesses who like the status quo. They don't like industry disruptors. Mm-hmm. They don't like innovators. They don't like competition. They're lobbied. They are represented by people like the CBI. And, the CBI has been wrong in the UK on every single major economic issue of the last 40 years. They didn't want the Thatcherite reforms. They said we shouldn't leave the ERM in the early 90s. The CBI said we must join the euro, otherwise it would be a disaster for the UK. And then the CBI were big advocates of Project Fear in 2016. On every single one of those issues, the multinationals lobbying group, the CBI, has been wrong.
Okay, I can accept that that's your position on that. You mentioned Northern Ireland there very briefly, and I'm just looking today, Northern Ireland Secretary Karen Bradley has said that the WTO rules are clear in terms of border checks between Ireland and Northern Ireland, and said the fact is that the WTO requires that where there are two different customs territories, there have to be contemporaneous consignment checks on goods passing between the two territories. Do you accept that she's correct?
I haven't heard that quote. What I do know is that the percentage of checks of non-EU goods coming into the European Union is between 1% and 2% of goods. Okay? So it is tiny because it is all now done electronically. And the WTO rules are very clear that under a thing called the Trade Facilitation Agreement, the thrust, the onus on trading nations is to reduce barriers, both tariff barriers but also non-tariff barriers, as much as possible. So the trend is to reduce checks, not increase them. And the WTO, system is a sensible system. It's what, of course, the vast bulk of global trade is done under. And it seems to work rather well for countries like America and Australia and China. So if it can work for them, it can work for us.
What then do you say to somebody perhaps in County Fermanagh or County Cavan who's afraid that they won't be able to sell a few cows or a load of hay to their neighbour up the road on the other side of the border?
Let's be very clear about that. That's a really good example, a few cows. So what's the difference between a cow eating... All right, what's the difference between a cow eating grass on the field in Northern Ireland and on the same field with the same type of grass on the same soil, literally a few hundred yards in the same field on the other side of the border? There is no difference. A third of all trade that goes across that border, as I understand, is milk or livestock. Right?
A third of the trade is milk or livestock?
That is what I'm told.
I don't
Let's just think about all the delicious Guinness that is produced in Dublin and goes up to Northern Ireland, produced by Diageo. Right? There are no checks on that. That is an excellent product that I rather enjoy. And there are no checks on the quantity of excise duty that is paid by Diageo to HMRC, because it's a thing called trust between authorised economic operators. And that is a very sensible solution. The quantity of large firms we're talking about between Ireland and Northern Ireland is less than 100. All of these firms can be sensibly certificated and approved as authorised economic operators. The vast majority of small businesses, the quantities you're talking about, it is so small, it's not worth bothering with. It's like a round of drinks.
You're really unaware of the avalanche of smuggling that existed when there was two different essentially economic regimes on either side of the border.
Are you telling me there's no smuggling at the moment? We've got 4 different regimes already. You've got a different currency across the border currently. You've got different income tax, different corporation tax, and different excise duty. Right, as far as I'm aware, that doesn't seem to be a problem for people.
It absolutely is a problem, and it causes a serious problem where there are differentials.
The it's no different at all. You haven't answered me there. You haven't answered me on this crucial point where I've just now exposed the flaw in your argument. 4 different things are different across that border, and no one is complaining at the moment. So why is it any different if a cow moves across that same field from one side of the border to the other side of the border?
Well, first of all, I'm not answering the questions, I'm asking them. But to answer that point, to answer the point,
you're the people that are making an issue out of this problem, so you jolly well should answer some of the questions.
To answer that point, to the extent that there are different taxation regimes, particularly on fuel, there is an acute problem with smuggling.
So you're already admitting to the smuggling, so why worry about any more smuggling that goes on?
It's
tiny in the context of things.
Because when you have more products subjected to a differential regime, be it taxation or standards, that opens the opportunity for more smuggling.
I will say again, the quantity that we're talking about in the overall scheme of trade that goes on across the European Union is absolutely tiny.
Would you take into account, Richard, people like David Davis making statements that implied he thought that the Republic of Ireland was still in the UK, another Conservative MP thinking that because he was born in England he was entitled to a Republic of Ireland passport. Would you take into account that Irish people don't have a very high degree of confidence in the level of information and the level of analysis that British politicians are giving the issue?
I don't know about that. That's not for me to comment on. What I know is that, this situation has been very cleverly and very successfully inflated to be a huge issue when actually the EU's own expert that you seem to ignore has recommended the same solution that the European Research Group and ourselves at Leave.EU He are recommending, which is the use of technology, trusted traders, authorized economic operators, and using that solution, it can all be dealt with, and there really is no issue.
Okay, to address that point exactly, there are some people in Ireland who are afraid that that bunch of technology and solutions that you mention, there are some people in Ireland who are afraid that that's essentially a herd of unicorns. And there are people on the British side, not least yourself and the ERG, that's the European Research Group, the pro-Brexit Conservative MPs, who say that that's doable. Isn't it completely reasonable then for the EU to say, okay, if you can do that, go ahead and do that, and until and unless that's successful, we're going to stick with the current situation?
No. We've said we're leaving, right? And we've said this solution, this is a perfectly sensible solution. And, that's what we're going to use. We see no reason to change that.
Sure. And how many companies have been contracted to set up those systems?
Is a positive. Let's remember, what you need is simply a question of goodwill between two sides. I tell you what, guys, let's be honest. The Good Friday Agreement, no one said it was perfect. Everyone knew there were huge compromises, right? Mm-hmm. But it was better than the alternatives. And you know what they did? They tried it. And here we are, over 20 years later. Many people would say it's still not perfect, but
Richard,
it's a lot better than the alternative.
Address the point that the people in Ireland and in North and South are essentially being told that what might be a herd of unicorns is coming round the corner. They're not going to let go of the current situation of the Good Friday Agreement situation in particular until that herd of unicorns actually arrives. They want to see it rather than see a promise.
Well, I take the view that we're talking about existing technology, existing systems of authorized economic operators that the EU's own expert said will work. So what we should do, guys, is...
But something else happened in 1997.
Let me answer the question.
Okay.
Right? So tell you what, guys, let's try this for 5 years. And if that technology needs tweaking, if technology's evolved so it can get even better, even more advanced, even less friction, great. Let's adopt it for the next 5 years and the next 5 years and the next 5 years. But it's a bit, if you say something can't be done, it's a bit like...
No, nobody's saying it can't be done. What they're saying is that until and unless you stick with the current situation.
What?
Nobody's saying it can't be done. They're saying until and unless it's implemented, you stick with the current situation, i.e. use the backstop.
Brilliant. So if Thomas Edison hadn't tried to progress something called the light bulb, we'd still be operating with candles.
Not at all. It's that you don't blow out your candle until the light bulb works.
It's called progress.
But
right?
sure, hold on for a second, Richard. People on both sides of the border in Ireland are essentially being asked to blow out their candles and dispose of all their candles on the promise that a light bulb will come.
No, we're not. What we're doing is we're accepting that, we move from the current situation, right, to the situation that's recommended by the EU's own expert. You've already accepted. And therefore, I presume that people you talk to in Ireland know and accept and understand that a quantity of smuggling goes on at the moment. But it is so small, it is so low level that actually it's, you're making a much bigger issue of this than actually needs to be made of.
You do sound a little bit like a general who's willing to fight to the last drop of somebody else's blood, but I think we've exhausted that particular issue.
I think that's a pretty offensive remark, frankly.
But it is something you're asking people to accept. You're asking people to accept a particular Brexit without a backstop that has been written into Theresa May's deal, which you've written is the worst deal in history recently on Conservative Home. But I think we will bore our listeners if we go around in that circle again. And I just want to ask you on one other issue. Sky did a poll on the evening of the publication of the Theresa May deal. it broke down people's wanting to go with that deal, to go with no deal, or to go with staying in the EU. Staying in the EU by a fairly wide margin outnumbered everything else put together. Are you sure that Brexit still has a democratic mandate?
I'm completely sure that Brexit has a democratic mandate. Let's be very clear that if you split the Leave vote into two, then of course Remain's going to win in what was a relatively close result. That's just a false choice. If you put a choice to the British people tomorrow, would you want to remain or would you want to go to a world trade deal and save £39 billion? I'm extremely confident that Leave would win, and we wouldn't be paying the European Union any money at all. We could invest it in our public services, in our infrastructure, and other fine things.
There's what's called a referendum. That's to say people rank their choices 1, 2, 3, and the choice that is most popular overall wins. Would you be confident in putting that to the British people?
I don't think we need to put anything back to the British people. The reality is we've had...
Need being aside, would you be confident?
We've had two votes. We had the referendum, we had the general election, and it was quite clear that that's how democracy works.
Well, can I just address that? Can I address that exactly? Can I address that exactly? Because the point has been made.
You had two referendums on the Lisbon Treaty, but our situation is we've had a referendum. The people were told that the will of the people would be carried out. It should be carried out. It was reinforced by the fact that over 80% of voters last year in the general election voted for parties that were going to leave the single market and were going to leave the customs union. And that should be respected. Otherwise, you end up with a complete loss of trust in democracy in a great nation like ours.
Okay, the British journalist and commentator Peter Hitchens made the point that referendums are pretty rare in the UK. Referendums in Ireland are almost a pedestrian thing that and we do it whenever we're bored. Certainly maybe one a year in my lifetime. But we have developed really a very detailed protocol for that, and there's what's called the Citizens' Assembly, whereby a representative group of people hear expert opinions and make a decision as to what sort of questions should be asked. That goes through Parliament, and again, experts on both sides are called in and questioned very carefully on what the effect of voting one way or the other would be. The reality is, isn't it, that people who were voting for Brexit didn't really know what they were getting, including people who were ardent Brexiteers. David Davis said that his preference would be to remain in the customs union and in the EU. Daniel Hannan.
Hang on. He kind of said he was going to remain in the EU.
Yeah, he did. I've got the quote here. My preference would be that we should remain within the customs union of the EU.
Well, I haven't heard him say that.
Okay, I'll put a link to the quote and thing. Daniel Hannan, also an extraordinarily strong Brexiteer, during the referendum said, quote, "Nobody's talking about leaving the single market." Anybody hearing a senior Brexiteer saying, quote, "Nobody's talking about leaving the single market," could reasonably have concluded that voting for Brexit would not lead to leaving the single market. Isn't it true that there was a deficit of information, that everybody knew what staying in the EU would mean? Nobody really knew what leaving would mean.
Individuals may have said individual things. There was a £9 million leaflet that went to every household in the country that said on 5 separate occasions that our relationship with the single market would be fundamentally changing. There was no question that we were going to leave.
Hold on for a second. About that leaflet. The point is, that side lost. When a government is being criticised about its policy, it's no real point in going to the manifesto of the losing party in the previous election.
You're not hearing me out. That side made put out a brochure that said if you vote to leave, your relationship with the single market will fundamentally change. We voted to leave, but right. Millions of people read that brochure, and they have a perfect entitlement that will then be carried out.
That was an anti-Brexit leaflet, which people clearly didn't believe because they voted for Brexit. They believed and trusted the Brexiteers who said that there would be no change in the single market.
Let me try again and explain what I've just explained. See if we can make some progress. That leaflet said, if you vote to leave, you will be voting to change the relationship with the single market. Mm-hmm. Guess what? We voted to leave, so therefore everybody who read that leaflet understood that the relationship with the single market would change. And the key reason for that is there was a significant concern in this country about unlimited, low-skilled immigration under the freedom of movement rules. And people wanted that to change. Mm-hmm. Pure and simple. And never underestimate, for all your experts and whatever, never underestimate the gut instinct of the ordinary voter. And, you know, in my lifetime... Can I say
one thing about that gut instinct?
Hear me out. In my lifetime, in every general election we've had, given the circumstances of the UK at the time, I don't think the electorate have ever got it wrong in terms of the government they have returned. I trust the gut instincts and the common sense of the ordinary UK voter.
Well, when Irish people hear that and they see people either commenting on the internet or in radio phone-ins or whatever, and they say that they demand an end to freedom of movement, that they don't want, as you said, low-skilled immigration from the EU, and then they hear that their chance and opportunities to go to EU countries will also be equally limited, and react with outrage and think that this is some incredibly unreasonable reaction against that. You do have to question exactly how much people internalise that, don't you?
Not at all. Look, this is our country, right? And we've always operated on a basis where we welcome sensible, fair levels of immigration that suit the needs of our economy. That's no different to any other country around the world, right? Whether it's Ireland, whether it's Australia or wherever. You know, this is our nation, and we should welcome sensible,
great
fair
swathes
levels
of British people did not internalise the fact that if they impose visa restrictions on people from the continent coming to Britain, it was inevitable that that would be reciprocated and that British people's chance to travel to the continent would equally be limited.
Can you just clarify what you mean by the expression internalise?
By the fact that on radio call-ins and on internet comments, when the issue that British people will likely need to get a visa to long-term travel or to work on the continent, they react with absolute fury and say that this is unfair and that this is a vendetta against Britain from the EU.
Well, I personally haven't heard that on radio phone-ins, but the reality is that, you know, there are countries outside of the European Union whose citizens do not need visas to come and travel in the European Union because you have sensible
for 90 days out of 180. Typically.
Typically, and whatever is agreed. And that is a sensible basis so that you can welcome tourist travel, you can welcome short-term business travel. That is completely and utterly different from the situation of someone having...
Typically British people who have an apartment on the Costa del Sol or in Marbella or somewhere and who live there for 6 or 7 months of the year will not be allowed to do that. And they are very angry. But that issue was not raised during the referendum, and people rightfully say that they never knew that would be the case.
Well, I'd be surprised if that was the case. But let's be very clear. Since the referendum, I was saying that the British government should be unilaterally making it crystal clear that all these EU citizens that were in the UK at the time of the referendum should be welcomed and embraced because they were here under the rules. And, you know, I think the government was wrong not to make that unilateral offer. That would be a very sensible thing to do, and they should have relentlessly communicated that ever since. The fact that we're still discussing the status of citizens on either side 2 and a bit years later is frankly a disgrace, and people should be ashamed of it. I'm very clear about my view on it. We should have unilaterally made that offer and then said to the European Union, we've made that offer because that's the right thing to do, and we expect you to do the same.
Moving on, Aaron Banks, who you'll be familiar with, who was part of Leave.EU, I think, he's made a series of contradictory statements about whether and how many times he has met Russian contacts. He's also made contradictory statements about whether his insurance company data and resources from Leave.EU were mixed. What would your response be if it was confirmed that your campaign was based on foreign money or had foreign influence designed to damage the UK?
Look, I'm not here to defend any individual comments that someone else has made, whether it be Aaron or anybody else. Mm-hmm. He's denied that. He deserves.
Well, in fairness, he hasn't made a single clear statement.
Yes, no, that is completely wrong. He's denied that. He's denied it on the Andrew Marr show a couple of weeks ago.
But on the point, he confirmed it.
Are you going to let me answer the question, or are you going to keep interrupting? Right, I'm going to answer the question. He has denied it. He deserves the same judicial right that any other UK citizen has, which is that you are innocent until proven guilty. Right? It's being investigated by the National Crime Agency. They will come to their determination. But, he has denied it, and that should be taken as that. What I am absolutely crystal clear about is that the people making those allegations, the Electoral Commission in the UK, twice this year, they have been found, firstly, by High Court judges to have misled the High Court. That is a very serious allegation.
I'm not talking about the
NCA. Hear me out. This is the Electoral Commission, right? Mm-hmm. Second time round, they were found by High Court judges to have misinterpreted their own rules. If they can't interpret their own rules, frankly, what chance has anybody else got? Their track record is woeful. Their chief executive has been fired in disgrace because of this. So I think let's look at the track record of the people making these allegations. Let's think about all of the people, the journalists, investigators and things who have looked at this issue, and they haven't come up with a scrap of evidence.
I'm not talking about evidence. Richard, I'm not talking about evidence. I'm talking about you. Let's wait and see what the
answer is when it's investigated by the NCA.
Absolutely. And I'm entirely willing to do that. But my question to you, Richard, my question to you is, in the event, clearly it's hypothetical, in the event that it was confirmed that foreign influence or foreign money was involved and the influence was designed to damage the UK, how would you feel?
It's not designed to damage the UK. It's designed to win the referendum. And let me clarify. Goldman Sachs was one of the biggest donors to the Remain camp. Mm-hmm. Goldman Sachs in the UK is, guess what? It's a subsidiary of an overseas corporation, right? Mm-hmm. And they spent money on the campaign. That money basically is overseas money because it's a subsidiary of an overseas corporation. So there is no difference between what Goldman Sachs did and the allegations that people are making against Mr. Banks.
Well,
so
I'm not making any allegations. I'm not making any allegations, but it is plain that hundreds of thousands of Twitter bots, for example, have been disabled, even just recently, who were promoting conflict in the United States and promoting hardline positions on both left and right. And clearly the Russian IRA, it's called the Internet Research Agency, it's an arm of Russian military intelligence. What they're doing is attempting to sow discord by promoting promoting conflict.
That sounds appalling, and we should do everything possible.
In the event that they also gave money or influence your campaign, how would you feel?
Look, I am totally confident that there is no Russian money involved in our campaign. I've no doubt about that. And, we all know that the Russian state has done some appalling things in recent years. I would just reiterate this point that what people seem to be getting so excised about as to whether or not Mr. Banks used money from overseas is exactly the same structure that Goldman Sachs used in order to fund the Remain campaign. So people shouldn't throw stones at glass houses if they're not prepared to look at their own behaviour.
Richard Tice, British businessman, co-chair of Leave.EU and founder of Leave Means Leave. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Great pleasure.
Make your view heard. Dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. You can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
Go to the website for sources and references for everything we were talking about. And while you're there, please follow the show on Facebook, follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter, and follow Richard Tice at Tice Richard, and get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or topic for a future show. Also, you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. It's all at www.here'show.ie. And finally, there's a link to my Patreon account there as well. So if you'd like to make a small donation to help make the podcast more frequent than it's been recently anyway, with more research, I'd really appreciate that. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.